Hello everyone. In this video we'll learn about special moves in chess. They're called special moves because they don't have much to do with the moves you learnt in the last video. There are three mainly. Well, there are only three. One is called castling because you imitate a castle to protect your king. The other one is called passant. I don't know how you pronounce that. You probably know French better than me. And it's used to take a pawn, to capture pawns, capturing pawns. And the other one is called promotion, which is a very important feature in the end game, so the end of the game. We'll start by looking at castling. One of the main rules in the beginning of a game, with the opening, is that you should be castled by move 10. It's not a rule, so you don't have to follow it, but it's good to follow it because it's great. It's just a guideline, in castling consists of moving the king and the rook one over the other, protecting it. So, for example, in a situation like this, okay, white has completed its opening and has developed all its pieces. The king always moves first in castling, and usually you'd see the king only being able to move to this square, and this square. But because there are two rooks here, one on the queen's side and one on the king's side, the king can move here. And when the king moves here, then the rook automatically comes over the king. And if you can castle both to the queen's side, so with this rook here, which is further away, and this rook here, it creates this sort of, well, castle, I guess, this barricade, which traps in the king, but it also controls these three squares here, this square here, not this one, this one here. And so it's a very, very powerful move, and the king is safe there. This is what happens if you castle king's side. If you castle queen's side, so you castle from the long side, something like this happens, and instead of having the king here and the rook here, you have the king under the third pawn, and the rook outside. This is also a good technique, but the king is much more exposed here from the diagonal, and this rank is also quite exposed. So kingside castling is probably the most useful, and most chess experts agree that when the two rooks are connected, so when a rook can move to the other rook, so after castling, the opening phase of the game has finished, and it starts being the tactics phase. So that's castling, and of course you can see here that the black can do exactly the same. It can move either here and castle kingside, or here and castle queenside. It's called castling kingside and castling queenside because this is the side of the king, so here stands the king, and he can castle here, or the queen is here, and that's why it's longer, because the queen usually is here. That's why it usually, in most openings, it consists of developing and taking away, well, developing and bringing out both bishop and knight here, so you can castle. I might do a video on just castling at some point because it is such an important strategy. the next two are you if there is a pawn, this is a white pawn, and it's on this rank here. Then black, if it wants to move this pawn, will have the option of moving it 1 square or 2 square. This move was invented because there were so many debates in courts all over Europe if pawns should take 2 steps at the beginning of 1 step. So many people played with just 1 step. So that means he could only move here, and therefore white could take it. But other people move 2 steps. And what happens here is that before this rule came in, any good player would move his pawn up to here. But what happens is that because it can move here as well, the white, it moves here, and the white pawn can take through here. It's down here, even if it does not go on the same square as the pawn, it can take. And this can only happen between pawns and pawns when there is a pawn on this rank, or in this rank in this case if this moves here, and only at the opening, only as soon as it's moved. So if I waited a turn, I would lose my chance to take this pawn here. Yes, and here we see this is the board flip, so it's white turn, and the pawn was here, white takes without actually touching the square. And it's a useful thing to know because most beginners haven't actually heard of this rule or don't pay attention to it, and it's useful to know because it's a good tactic as well, because it holds back here this pawn here holds back this pawn here and this pawn here. There aren't any pawns there anymore, but it's a good tactical position because you're dominating the center and you're dominating your enemy's ranks as well. And the next move is probably the best of all, the one that's worth most, and it comes in the end game, which is it's the end of the game, as the word itself says. Usually they call it, I'll do a video on the end game, they call it the end game when most pieces are traded, and usually the queen, though there can be exceptions. And in these end games, it's a common ending is the one with the king's left, and maybe a couple of pawns and a few of the minor piece, maybe a bishop or a knight. And here is when pawns are actually worth much more than we talked about pawns not being worth almost anything, but in the end game this changes completely, and especially if you're in a position like this pawn is worth as much as a queen. Usually logically, because they can only move 1 step forward each time once they're at the end of the board, they're quite useless. But with this rule called promotion, what happens is that when it reaches this square here, you can choose to promote it to queen, rook, bishop, or knight. Usually it's promoted to a queen because that's the best piece, but in certain occasions it's also promoted to rook, bishop, or knight. You can have more than 1 queen in at a time. That there is no rule that says that you can't. Sometimes you have 3 because you had the original queen and an additional 2 with promotion. Theoretically, you could have 9 queens in at the same time, but that's that's probably not. It's possible, but not very probable. And here we see white promoting good to queen, and having a great upper hand against the lone black king, which is doomed here really, because there's nothing he can do. So, going back on your steps, castle. Castling means putting the king to safety. You switch the positions of rook and king, and one comes here and one comes here, so they switch the positions. And passant is when a pawn moves here, white pawn now can take like this, because it would be as if it had actually moved to the third rank here instead of the fourth. Promotion. When a white pawn gets to the end, it can promote to one of the minor or major pieces, so bishop, knight, rook, or queen. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video and made you grow as a chess player. These are very important tactics, and they're good to know, even if most of them aren't really known by beginners, and it's good to know them, so your style of play will become much better. Thank you very much.